I'm here with Chief Warrant Officer 3, retired Austin Roth, president of Break Turn, former Army helicopter pilot, current airline pilot. Views are our own, don't represent any airline or the military or DOD. I want to get that out of the way. But he has some amplifying information that we wanted to talk about regarding the mishap in the DCA area at the Potomac. And before we get started, Austin, thanks for joining us. And what is your background specifically?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So my background is I retired in June of 2023. I retired from 12th Aviation Battalion, which is the unit that was associated with the crash. So the Blackhawks came from that unit, different company than I was in, which I guess would be kind of not even really a squadron, smaller than that, maybe like a flight.
Okay.
So 8 Blackhawks in a company. There's 3 companies there, so different company than I was in, but I've flown the model Blackhawk that they fly. The company I was in, we flew the newer model, and then was there for 3 years. The 3 years that I was there, I overlapped with the pilot in command. He and I were in the same company for basically the whole time. He got there maybe a couple months before I did, and he was fresh out of flight school. So that was his first duty station. So he was a brand new co-pilot. I was a standardization instructor pilot and instrument evaluator. So in kind of the scheme, you've got a co-pilot, then a pilot in command. Then if you're going to go down the instructor kind of track, which for the Army is where warrant officers go, then you'd have an instructor pilot, then a standardization instructor pilot, and you don't have to be an instrument evaluator for that, but that's kind of an additional qualification.
So you were top of that basically at the
in terms of ratings, yeah.
So what does that unit, what's their mission? Like what were you guys doing? What was the purpose? Where were you, and kind of what were they training for?
So it's already been pointed out, Pete Hegseth has pointed out that it's a continuity government mission. So they're kind of peers with the other branches, helicopter units that are there, and also the V-22 guys down for HMX-1. So you've got HMX-1 and 1st Helo and 12th Aviation Battalion that do the VIP support, and then also the COG mission. And so that's that unit's primary mission.
And so you said the model of Blackhawk was a 60 Lima, like an older.
Yeah, that's a Lima. So they've got 2 companies of Limas,
okay,
which are the older model. They're an upgraded kind of version of the Alpha model, which is the original Blackhawk. So the airframes are the same. They just changed the engine and the transmission.
Okay.
So the original one came out in, I think, like 78 or something like that.
Yeah.
So the avionics are the same, essentially. A couple really small differences, but it's essentially 6-pack, old steam gauges. And then the Mike model is the newer one. So when you see the black and gold ones, there's been a lot of pictures of the black and gold ones, which are super cool looking, but there's only 4 of those. Those are all Mike models. Okay. So those are the newer model. Those were in the company that I flew in.
So they were in an older steam gauge, kind of like when I flew the T-38A, where it's, standard ADI altimeter stuff. No helmet, right? Because I know later Blackhawks, they flew around with the helmet display. There's nothing helmet mounted.
So yes and no. So there's no helmet display. There's some stuff in testing right now, but Army wide, there's no helmet displays. I think you're probably thinking of an Apache that has that.
I just flew DCS. They had it in one of the DCS Blackhawks. That's the only thing I know.
Yeah, no, that's not. Well, what there is there's an NVG HUD. So it clips on the end of your night vision.
Okay.
But in the Army right now, the U.S. Army, anyways, like I said, there's some other stuff. There's some other countries that fly with the day HUD. But right now, there's only a night HUD, and those are in the Lima, and then there's a newer one that's essentially the same that the Mike model has. But for all intents and purposes, that's a night vision HUD, and they're all the same.
So they would have had it flying on NVGs that night.
I would say could have had it, not necessarily would have. It's usually not required for the same reasons that you don't require kind of all kinds of stuff, because it's like, well, if it's a requirement, it's broken. You can't go fly. But it's a risk mitigator. But I personally never found it to be super helpful, especially like the kind of situation that the crash happened in. Right at that moment, it wouldn't have really been helpful at all. It's helpful for dust landings, because it does have like a velocity cue on it. So when you're trying to get to 0 airspeed and 0 drift, but you can't see the ground, and you still kind of want to be outside looking for the ground, it's useful. Just flying around straight and level or whatever, it's not as useful. And in a Mike model, I didn't find it to be particularly useful at all.
So the night vision goggles themselves, I flew with the old green ones. Were these white phosphorus, panoramic NVGs?
These are probably, yeah, not panoramic, but probably white phosphor. So they switched in like 2021, 2022. They were switching over to the white phosphor.
We had Daniel on Flores who flew with them, and he said they're hard to see LED lights. Like they make LED lights really hard to see.
I would actually say all of them are hard to see LED lights. There's a reason for that. So LED, you know, if you ever touch LEDs, they're cool to touch.
Right.
You know, compared to like traditional lighting where you touch and it's hot. So night vision can see in the near IR spectrum. And so they actually see incandescent lighting better than LEDs. So we can talk more about that. But if you're ever looking out at, you know, if there's an approach corridor and you're looking at all those arrivals, it's possible that by your naked eye, you're looking out. And if you were to put night vision on, it would almost invert the brighter lights versus the dimmer lights. So it's impossible to just kind of even look out at a bunch of arrivals and say like, well, that one's brighter. So that way, if you put night vision on, it would be brighter. That's not entirely true because of that near IR spectrum. Matter of fact, the FAA put something out in 2018, I think. It's called, I think, a SAFO. I'm going to have a safety advisory for operators, which is something that they put out just to say like, hey, you should be aware of this. And what they were saying is all this tower lighting that's going up now is LED. And there's some night vision that can't see it. And so lit towers on the map might actually be lit, but you're only going to see them under the naked eye. You're not going to see them with night vision on.
No kidding.
So you can't really just look at an airplane and be like, it's super bright. You'd obviously be able to see it under night vision, or that one is brighter, so it would be brighter under night vision. That's not true. When they first get told about traffic, if you're looking at the map, so you've got everybody's essentially lined up to land runway 1, so more or less to the north. They're going to start at basically straight along the river, and they're going to go more or less straight over the middle of the river, and they're lined up to land runway 1. Occasionally, they'll circle land 3-3. When Pat 25 is first told about the traffic, they're told your traffic is CRJ south of Memorial or south of Wilson Bridge, 1,200 feet, circling to land 3-3. So just in the abstract, when I first heard that, you know, that night or the next morning, I was like, man, I know what happened is that they're looking opposite direction, straight down the runway at that point. And talking about all the night vision stuff that I said, where it's like, well, it could be brighter, it could be dimmer, it could be opposite of what you see under the unaided vision. They're seeing everybody lined up there, and those aircraft are separated by a couple degrees at most. So it could be really easy to perceive one as closer that's actually not closer. Depending on how they're sequencing everybody in as well, sometimes the aircraft that's, you know, lower is actually farther away, and they'll kind of sequence them in first. So there's a lot of different factors, plus the different kinds of lighting, plus they're wearing white phosphor, so it makes everything kind of super bright. And then the NTSB, you guys talked about this a little bit, said the last part of that transmission was cut off on the Black Hawk, so it wasn't received by the Black Hawk. And so when I heard it the first time, I thought, man, I never saw anybody land 3-3. Even though I know it's common, I never actually saw it. And I thought, man, it'd be really easy to not hear that last part, or not. That's a really busy part of flight. You're 200 feet. It's night. There's other traffic. It'd be really easy to not hear that or not understand it. And you're seeing all this traffic, and all you've ever seen is them land runway 1, and you just kind of picked the wrong one. And then the NTSB said also that part of the transmission got cut off. And as soon as I heard that, my heart just sunk, and I was like, yeah, pretty impossible then. The next thing that happens is they're told they're circling to land 3-3. I think that aircraft is at that point kind of tapering away from them. So you've got the one going straight down the river, they're going straight down the river. If you kind of lock on the wrong one, just the way that lighting works, obviously, landing lights and everything, it's just like headlights in it for those non-aviators, it's just like headlights in a car. If you're on the highway and you're on going one direction, they're going the other, it's super bright. But as soon as they kind of start to pass you, it gets dimmer again, even before they've passed you. Or if they start to turn, as soon as they start to turn, it gets dimmer.
You're swinging
and so you've got one aircraft. You've got one aircraft that's coming more or less straight at you, which is going to be super bright. And that's probably what you're expecting. And you've got one aircraft that's tapering away from you that's actually lower, closer into the city lights, making it harder to see just by essence of being closer to the horizon and down, kind of starting to get close to the lights, or maybe even down in lights a little bit. But they're also tapering away from you. So that lighting system in the aircraft is not going to be as bright as you would expect. And then to make it more, when I said that I never saw anybody land 3-3, The reason why I never saw that, and asking the other, people that are still in the unit and people that have been in the unit before, the reason why I never saw them land 3-3 is because we were always told to hold at Haynes Point. So if you look on the helo route charts, so we were always told to hold at Haynes Point. I won't say always. Everybody that I know said that they were held at Haynes Point. And usually what they would say is hold at Haynes Point, but they wouldn't tell you why.
Mhm.
Or maybe they would say landing traffic, but they wouldn't say traffic landing 3-3, you're going to cross their path, you need to be aware of that. They would just tell you as little as they have to, hold at Haynes Point. And so then you're either doing little tiny circles, which is usually what I would do. I know guys that would just come to a high hover there. I would usually do circles, but I do have a higher workload because now you're 200 feet, you're in DC. The river there is only 150 yards wide, maybe, or 200 yards wide.
Mhm.
You don't want to fly over the, buildings and people and roads and stuff. So
Right.
you're trying to stay over the river, especially at night. Like, you got your hands pretty full. You're holding at Haynes Point, but you're not necessarily thinking about like, why am I holding at Haynes Point? Let me watch this landing traffic. Let me see what an approach to 3-3 looks like, because I don't know. Maybe someday they'll have me cross that path.
Right.
You're pretty busy, and so even if it was they're landing 3-3 and they kind of told you about it, you wouldn't necessarily be too concerned about that. I'm here, they're down there. I got other stuff to worry about.
So typically geographically separated, how wide is that route? I mean, people have talked about them being off course. Were they still within the route corridor?
That's a great question. So the NTSB, during their update brief, so initially in their first briefing, they said they believed that at that time that the helicopter was within the lateral dimensions of the route, is what they said. So Route 4. That was the terminology they said, within the lateral dimensions. And then when they gave their update brief, they said, actually, we need to revise that. We do believe that they were more or less on the route, but there are no lateral dimensions of the route. So when
Oh,
they said it the first time, that was what I thought. I was like, I don't remember there being lateral dimensions.
yeah.
So there aren't any. It's one of those rare times where, as an instrument evaluator, you spend a lot of times in the TERPS manual, terping out approaches.
Mhm.
So you are very familiar with kind of on any given chart how wide it actually is.
Yeah.
Pilots, we're not always, I've got my like company or military dictates like how far off I'm allowed to be. But there is nothing on the charts or anywhere else that says what those helicopter routes are, what their lateral dimensions are.
Really? So
Now that said, they were basically right on the blue line. So if you look at where they crashed, the helicopter didn't even sink. It was still exposed in the water. So it's more or less right on the shoreline.
yeah.
If you look at the way that it's depicted, the blue line goes right along the shore. You can barely even make out the line that it shows
Yeah.
the shore, because the blue line for the course is more or less right on top of it. So where they actually ended up in the water was basically right on the line.
So if they had been, because I want to talk about the altitudes here in a second, but just
Yeah.
geographically speaking, if they had been on altitude at the point where they crossed, I mean, you're only talking maybe 50 feet, 100 feet separation, altimeter errors and stuff like that. I
Yeah.
mean, what does that do for the helicopter? I mean, we're talking a hatter just by geographical, right?
So it would not be good. I mean, also, if you think about, the more I've started thinking about like wake turbulence and things like that.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
even if they do pass behind that aircraft, now you've got a helicopter flying right through wake turbulence. I ran it out for the RNAV. The RNAV there is a 3.1 degree glide slope
Mhm.
about where the accident happened. The way that I kind of terped it out, it was about 270 feet. MSL
Yeah.
is
Wow.
about right where the accident happened, is where the 3.1 degree glide slope would be. So
Yeah.
it probably happened basically more or less right on glide slope.
So,
So within a few feet of it. The altitude is important to talk about.
yeah. Yeah. And I wanted to ask you about that because they talk about this. And do you use radar altimeter? Is that what you're using for these altitudes?
No,
Or are
so
you
that was another
using,
thing. Another thing you guys talked about, but again, it's like, if you're not there, and I've actually heard people that have been on the route say it wrong,
yeah.
which is they're like, oh, you're supposed to be at 200. They should have been using the radar altimeter. I'm like, no, actually, it's an
Okay.
MSL altitude.
All right.
So you can imagine those routes. The 200-foot part of the route goes all the way. You're in the city part of the time, like around the Pentagon. That's still part of that 200-foot section. It's 200 MSL, because if you're trying to fly off your radar altimeter, you'd be doing this the whole way.
Okay.
You've got highway there, and then there's no highway, and then you're flying over, river, and then you're cutting over a bridge, and it would just be impossible to fly radar altimeter. Those are all MSL altitudes. So they said 278 feet on the radar altimeter is what NTSB is saying. They think that's pretty much the only altitude they're sure of that in terms of what was displayed in the helicopter. And so I have every reason to believe that's accurate, but it's also not, it's not completely irrelevant, but it's less relevant than people might think it is. It's not as simple as just going, well, 278 is 278, because that's inside of the tidal basin of the river. So you've got tides, even you can't even necessarily look at it in any part of the ocean, even at kind of medium tide for that particular location, because that's not how MSL works. Right. So
cold night too. I mean, you got correction factors, cold day, all these stuff, all this high pressure. I mean, what's the setting? 75 feet between the two, I mean, all this
and how old was the setting? But I don't think we can talk more about this too. I think it's certainly possible that they were off on altitude. Even I think NTSB is being very cautious in saying they were off on altitude. So what they're saying right now is we at this point don't know.
Yeah.
That's what they've said the whole time. And actually, initially they said we believe that they were on altitude. The reason why they said that is because that's the secondary radar return.
Okay.
So they were 200, but that's literally just radar goes out, it hits the target, and it comes back. There's a difference between that and what the Mode C was reporting, I think. And so what they were getting off the transponder was a little bit different. So whatever the altitude on the number one side is, that's what the transponder is gonna send back to the radar. So, you could have a situation where that one is the error one, the other one is correct, or vice versa. But you're allowed to be 75 feet off. That's the FAA. The LEMA is, I think, the same. I don't think there's anything in the dash 10 that says anything different than that. So in theory, you could be 150 feet off from each other, but both be within 75 feet of field elevation when you take off, and that's a good check.
Yeah.
And then you could go fly. But you're actually seeing 150-foot difference, which at some point, I guess again, not listening to the audio, just kind of hearing how the NTSB is reporting it, there was a quick conversation like, hey, I'm showing us at 400, hey, I'm showing us at 300, but then they kind of didn't unpack it, meaning the pilots didn't really unpack it.
Yeah, that was confusing in the way the NTSB brought it up, because they said there was a discrepancy. Well, okay, was it a discrepancy that they found or that they talked about being different? Like, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like what they're saying is there was a discrepancy, meaning the pilots noted a discrepancy.
Okay.
Or at least that's how they're interpreting that, is that it was the pilots noting a discrepancy. Let's assume that's true. Let's say that the pilots were noting a discrepancy. I could see where in that moment, because that's right before things get real busy. So Chain Bridge is not very far away from where the tidal basin is, and then you kind of cut in between Jefferson Memorial and Lincoln. And then you go over the tidal basin, and then you go Route 1. That's the rest of Route 1. Then you go down and turn Route 4. So that all happens pretty quick. So I can understand where, just as pilots, sometimes you have to task stack a little bit, and you go, okay, well, that's not the most important thing right now. The most important thing is, like, let's not hit the bridge. There's a harbor right there. There's boats. There's other aircraft, right? It's a 100-foot discrepancy. Maybe we just set it at slightly different times or whatever. I called my altitude. You called your altitude. A couple seconds can make a difference because they were descending at that time. And so we really don't have time to unpack it right now. Let's just put a pin in that.
Yeah.
And you might not even articulate it that way. You just kind of know.
Yeah.
So the way that I read that in terms of what NTSB is saying is that it is something that the pilots talked about, but that I don't think that they've gotten to the point where they've taken the system apart yet and really tried to figure out exactly what it said. And they also brought up that what's recorded in the Blackhawk, it doesn't record those altitudes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so they've got pressure altitudes. They know what the pressure was coming from, like the engines and things like that. They're drawing all kinds of data. So it's called IVHUMS, the Integrated Vehicle Health Monitoring System. IVHUMS is recording all kinds of stuff like that, but that's not the same thing as, like, if you put an altimeter setting with a correct altimeter setting, what are the pilots actually seeing?
Right.
So again, it's like the radar altimeter, that data, and the NTSB didn't even say what altitude that said it was. I think they're looking at those and saying, like, well, we're seeing a lot of different kind of stuff here, and we're not really sure. So let's not be hasty.
Yeah.
That said, and we can talk more about this, I think it's somewhere between possible and likely that they were off altitude. One of the things you guys talked about was flying at the max altitude. Why would you fly at the max altitude?
Yeah.
Like, it just doesn't seem like good practice.
I've talked to guys that go down to like 50 feet. They've talked about in that area.
Yeah, and I would say if any of those guys are listening, you should stop talking about that. Because here's why. So the chart actually says, and your former military guy, the area planning one. So AP1, that's what says, hey, here's the rules inside of and it breaks it down by location for DoD pilots.
Mm-hmm.
So it says it on the marginal data of the chart for the helicopter routes, and I think it's actually an AP1 as well for the DC area.
Yeah.
That it says helicopter routes are to be flown at the highest prescribed altitude, except for ceilings or for weather, or as directed by ATC. So if you don't get one of those two checks, you should be at the top altitude.
Yeah.
And so I can say for my purposes, well, the other thing is, I'm not sure how the Air Force and Navy, because I know that's kind of your background. How are they about noise complaints? How do they?
Oh, I mean, we've got noise. Like if you go to Miramar, they're like La Jolla. If you fly over there, you're going to end up in the base CO's office talking about why you deviated, because they're very noise sensitive in a lot of places, and we try to not piss off the neighbors.
So the Army is the same way. They're very sensitive to people calling and having noise complaints, even though it's like, the base was there for 30 years and then you built a house and now you're calling noise complaints.
Right.
But they are very quick to try to fix the noise complaint issues.
Mm-hmm.
Now fly a helicopter at 200 feet night after night after night after night.
Oh yeah.
In a place where people have, number one, a lot of money, number two, a lot of power, because that is the power center of the United States.
Yep.
And Fairfax County is for years the richest county in the United States. People that have money like their sleep, and so the Army is already pretty knee jerk when it comes to noise complaints. But that area, I think they're particularly sensitive to it with good reason. And so one of the other things that was always coming up, and I know it was an issue when I was there, but I'm sure it's still an issue, was, hey, we keep getting noise complaints, so you really do need to fly at the top altitude. And I can say, as a standardization instructor pilot, as an instructor pilot, I actually did enforce that. And the reason is because that's what it says. Like, the book says what the book says, man.
Yeah. So can you just explain what the ride was itself? This pilot. So first of all, people are getting a lot of confused because they're like, she was the PIC, he's not. But everything I've flown, the instructor's the PIC. Like, what's the dynamic here? What was the ride? What was their intent? And this is a lot of people are asking this question: why are we doing training in this airspace? Which I know you're going to have an answer for, because everybody has an answer for this.
Yeah, I'm probably going to forget. Let me start with, so first of all, NTSB reported that there's 3 different types of flight evaluations, and they got those wrong. One of them, they said one is the annual. They said, I can't remember which 3 it was. It was like the instrument flight evaluation, the NVG evaluation, the annual evaluation. All of those are annual evaluations.
Okay.
The one that they missed, they said was annual, was, I think, the standardization flight evaluation. So the 3 are instrument flight evaluation, standardization, and night vision goggle. The NVG and stands, you can combine those 2.
Right.
So it says the most challenging mode of flight it can basically like cover for an easier mode of flight. And so basically it says, hey, for your annual, you have to do, let's say, an auto rotation.
Okay.
And there's all these columns. I'm sure the Air Force and the Navy are the same way. There's like a million different columns. And it's like, for this ride, you have to do these things. For this ride, you have to do these things. And some of those are redundant in the night vision and stands. And it will say you have to do an auto rotation for your stands and an auto rotation for your NVG eval. But if you do an NVG eval and you do an auto rotation, that would count for your stands evaluation.
Right.
And so you can do every task for the stands evaluation under night vision and do 2 rides for the price of 1.
Yeah,
which
makes sense.
which is very, very, very standard. That's almost always the way you're going to do it, because it's just more efficient. And so, so the NTSB reported it. They'll fix it. I think they've actually done an excellent job. And so they'll fix that at some point. But one little discrepancy there. Talking about the PIC, who's the PIC? So it's terminology that we don't really use in the Army as much, but it would be correct, more or less. Is aircraft commander. So the question is, who's the aircraft commander?
Right.
The aircraft commander was the instructor pilot. And the reason why sometimes it's been reported that she was the PIC, and actually it was reported that the crew chief was a standardization instructor pilot. Okay. Now, here's why this terminology is all really confusing. So he was an SI, standardization instructor. I
for other crew
was a
chiefs.
Standardization instructor pilot.
Yeah.
So it'd be really easy to confuse those 2 things. Standardization instructor is a instructor of crew chief instructors. So the same way a standardization instructor pilot is an instructor pilot, it's instructor. A standardization instructor is a flight instructor, which is what the crew chiefs call their guys, FIs. He is a standardization instructor over the FIs.
Yeah.
And so it'd be really easy to confuse those. But then she was a pilot in command. And so anytime you go out and do an evaluation in the Army, you are evaluated for whatever your position is. So if you're a pilot in command, you get evaluated as a pilot in command. If you're a co-pilot, we call him a PI. If you're a co-pilot, again, there is such a thing. This is really nuanced, but there is a co-pilot which is separate. But PI, we'll just say that's what somebody in the other seat is. If
Okay.
you are a PI, you're getting evaluated as a PI.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was logging PIC and was probably briefed as in terms of for the evaluation, but on the risk assessment and on the roster and all that stuff, she would have just been put on there as a co-pilot, basically.
Do you know what her qual was? Was her qual up to aircraft commander? I mean, had
She was a pilot in command, yeah. Okay. And she was actually an air mission commander as well.
So is it common for somebody to have 450 hours at her level and 1,000?
Yeah.
I mean, is hours, like how are hours working in the Army in a Black Hawk?
Yeah. So for her, that's another thing that's been reported is like, well, she was in a non-flying position. She wasn't. She was in a flying position. Actually, you have to have the highest minimums. If you're within 3 years of graduating flight school, you have to have the highest minimums no matter what you're doing. Okay. So I don't care if your duty position changes to, broom closet OIC.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. You've got to fly 48 hours semi-annually, which is the Army's highest semi-annual minimums. So they've got to find somewhere for you to go fly if you're within 3 hours of flights or 3 years of flight school. So she was either right at 3 years or maybe just a little bit outside of graduating flight school. So the whole time that she'd been in that unit, essentially, she'd had the highest minimums and was flying them. This whole the White House aide thing. I had somebody tell me, well, I was an aide. It is a full-time job. And I was like, were you White House aide? Were you White House social aide specifically?
Yeah.
I was like, no, I was an aide to some general. It's like, okay, this is a different job. I know the word aide is in it, but like,
right.
That's like a nights and weekends additional duty kind of thing, which, for a young lady that's in the DC area, regardless of political affiliation, I think would still be a pretty good job. And at some point you got to compete for major. And anything that you can do that's kind of like, I haven't seen that before, and kind of makes the board raise their eyebrows in a good way. You can do it in a bad way. This is probably in a good way. That's useful for your career, and a lot of people take those advantages where they can get them.
So it wasn't an additional duty, like she stopped flying. It was just what she was doing while because I think she was the exec or XO. What was the?
No, so she was the POL platoon leader at the time.
Oh, fuels.
So I know her company commander very well. He used to be in our company. Everybody that I've talked to said great things about her. That was essentially a position that they put her in because they needed some help there. So we have occasional.
Same in the
just like anybody else. We got we've every couple of years the Army's going to come down and they're going to look and see what's broken, and they will crush the boss if that stuff is broken.
Yeah.
And so things like POL, they are easily overlooked positions.
That is fuels, right? We're talking about
that's fuels. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Petroleum, oil, and lubricants.
Yeah. Just making sure it's the same. I'm like, if I don't know, somebody who's watching is not going to know either.
Yeah. So she was there as the PL platoon leader, basically like just to fix it. It's super broke. Nobody knows how to fix it. Can you fix it? And that was actually my understanding is because she was really good at reading and figuring things out and being a self-starter.
Yeah.
But that was still inside 12th Aviation Battalion's structure. And before that, she was a platoon leader in 12th Aviation Battalion in the flight company. And so she was in a flight position the entire time. She was flying. The only time that she spent down was she torn her ACL at some point, I guess.
Yeah.
And so it's been a little bit of time down for it. But even that, I heard I've torn my ACL twice.
Yeah.
Even from that, I've heard she was up in like a couple months, which to me, I was grounded for like
it's a long
almost a year the last time.
Yeah.
She was flying the whole time.
Flying here though, right? She was flying in this area.
No, in this unit. Like, she came straight there from flight school.
Okay, yeah.
No, this is her. Doing. She's been doing this for about 3 years at this point. Okay. This is where she's kind of grown up in aviation outside of flight school.
Yes.
So about the 450 hours. So she made pilot command about 450 hours. She's got about 500 when the crash happens.
Okay.
Um, was that normal? The answer is yes. Not just at that unit, but kind of army wide.
Mhm.
So again, this is one of those where it's really easy to say like, well, I've never heard of anybody with less than 700 or 1,000 hours being a pilot in command. It's like, well, yeah, probably when, that period of time that you were flying,
Right.
that was the case.
Yeah.
But for, I can say in my experience, when I was there from 2020 to 2023, um, that was pretty normal.
Yeah.
Somewhere between 400 and 500 hours making pilot in command. Um, if you were really quick, then it would be less than 400, maybe 450. If you were pretty normal, 450 to say like 700 would still be kind of in the normal, not great range. Not, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean normal, not great,
Mhm.
not terrible.
Right.
You could do it in 4, 5, 600 hours. Um, I made pilot command in Afghanistan and the medevac at 350 hours.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And that was in 2013, 2012, 2013. But yeah, it's not unheard of. I was teaching on the flight line at 500 hours.
Why are we training in this airspace? And I know the answer, right? I mean, you practice what you do, right? You're going to eventually
Yeah.
have to do VIP transport. You're not going to do check rides and stuff. So can you just explain why we're in this airspace without actually doing the mission, why we're training in the first place?
Yeah, for that exact reason, right? Number one, it's not like they were 50 miles away or 100 miles away and they were coming in because that's where they do the VIP support. Davison Army Airfield is under the Class Bravo shelf.
Mhm.
Like you're there. You go outside of Davison's airspace and the helo routes pick up right there.
Yeah.
And Route 4 takes you more or less almost all the way to Davison. So number one, that's where you start off anyways. Yeah, you could go to the south, you could do some other stuff, but again, it's an evaluation, so you're supposed to be evaluating things that they could be reasonably expected to do on a day-to-day basis. Uh,
Mhm.
so you could do some other stuff, but that is what we do on a day-to-day basis. I've been asked before, like, well, wasn't this like a high risk? And I'm like, no, it wouldn't have been briefed as a high risk because this is literally what you do every day.
Right.
Um, and so it may have been that particular spot may have been higher risk, but if
Mhm.
you're at a 1, you go to a 2, that's a higher risk.
Right.
We certainly did not perceive like going out and flying the helicopter routes. That's high risk. Um, I've had as many close calls. I had as many close calls at the 160th trying to run me over at Fort Campbell with no lights on as I
Yeah.
did. And I have had some close calls on the helicopter routes. Now, my close calls were always with helicopters
Mhm.
or V-22s
Okay. Yeah, the
flying
Osprey.
out there. Yeah, flying because they're allowed to fly on the helo routes as well. So my stuff was always helo route related, not fixed wing related.
Yeah.
And that's most people's experience. Not exclusively, but most people's experience there. So that wouldn't have been perceived as like well, this is really a high risk. This would have been perceived as like, this is literally what I do every day.
Was there any sense that this was a ticking time bomb at all? Like, was there any like talk in the squadron, like, hey, we're flying around with one of the busiest airports in the country and it's only a matter of time? Or was it pretty much this is business as
Not
usual?
not as it relates to DCA,
Okay.
or even Dulles because the helicopter routes go up there and then up to BWI. Yeah, definitely was not like, hey, we're flying around these airports and fixed wing is going to be that's a ticking time bomb.
Mhm.
Certainly was not perceived that way because again, most of the close calls were happening with helicopters. I think it was the day before. There was at DCA.
Mhm.
Have you seen this?
Yeah, I'm familiar, but go ahead. No, please continue.
Yeah, so there was initially started as a collision alert. So radar gets a collision alert, which they
Mhm.
also got the night of the crash. So they get a collision alert. This aircraft was going north on the route, so opposite direction on the route, but it's more or less the same. You kind of stair step up as you're going.
Mhm.
So they're 200 feet going northwest. So basically, everybody's doing the rover visual,
Mhm.
um, and these guys are doing the opposite direction up the river and slowly climbing as they go out. So radar gets a collision alert. Doesn't say anything. At the same time, the first aircraft that's coming into land gets a TA, so they get a traffic alert. When you get a TA, you don't have to respond to that for the most part in the airlines. It's making you aware. You get symbology.
Mhm.
You get an audible traffic, just to draw your attention to it. And so I think that they said something to tower, hey, we just got a traffic alert, and tower said, yeah, helicopter maintains visual separation or something to that effect. So they kind of, I'm not saying that they blew it off, but they kind of was like, okay, yeah, whatever, visual separation, that's just what they do here. Then the second aircraft that was coming into land, so a few miles behind them, they got an RA, so they got a resolution advisory, and they did a go around, which is the right thing to do. So now you get the traffic on your screen, changes color, and then you get a climb.
Yeah.
And so they got the climb, did a go around, and tower said, hey, what's the reason for the go around? Oh, we got an RA,
Yeah.
But because they're on a different frequency, I guarantee you that pad aircraft never knew.
Wow. Until they saw it on
never
Mass Aviation. Yeah.
Until they saw it on Vast Aviation.
Yeah.
But they didn't see it on Vast Aviation until after the Pat 25 crash.
Right. Wow.
And so I guess one of the questions that I have is, how often were collision alerts happening on radar? And if were those getting reported back to the DoD? Because I don't think they were. I certainly never heard about that. And because the way the DCA was with the different frequencies and everything, if an aircraft that's over top of you comes in, you cause an RA, they do a go around, you're on a different frequency, you'd never know. And so without any kind of reporting, how frequently was it happening? Because if it was happening really, really frequently, then you could do some analysis. As an instructor, you'd go, maybe I'll avoid these times. Hey, if they're like, hey, you're getting collision alerts on radar, you're causing go arounds, all this other stuff, and you know about it, then you can do some analysis and be like, well, when is that happening? Right? Maybe we should try to avoid those times as best we can. But if there's no reporting, then you're in an information deficit.
Talk about the visibility in the cockpit, right? You kind of talked about it with the NVGs. You're looking through, 2 toilet paper rolls, essentially. I mean, you're not getting a full field of view, but from that angle, looking left through, is there a lot of stuff in the way? Like if you're looking at something coming from high to low that would physically
so when
you?
you're looking left there, so like I said, initially they're looking down the runway and then down the river. Okay, it would be really easy to see all the lights, but the lights are only separated by a couple degrees. So you see all the lights for 100 miles right under night vision. That's actually one of the things we have a problem with new pilots and new crew chiefs. As soon as they throw their NVGs on for the first time, they're calling out traffic that's like 100 miles away.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
2 o'clock, airplane 2 o'clock.
The airliner I tried to rejoin on. Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, and I'm like, dude, we're at 500 feet. That's an airliner that's like 70 miles away, and they're at like 30,000 feet. But they just, because you perceive everything as being so close because it's bright. But so when they first get the call, that's what they're looking at, something that's really easy to see. And then they kind of continue down the river. Well, once you transition from Route 1 to Route 4 and you're looking south, the traffic down the river is still really easy to see.
Yeah.
Because you're looking, the water's dark. Maybe depending on the wind conditions and stuff, you're picking up some moonlight or some of the city lights and stuff off the waves, but compared to the city, it's still pretty dark. But the left side, so now as you're going south, the Blackhawk's left side is looking on the Maryland side of the shore. Number one, you're closer to that, so you've got water to your right, you've got shore basically to your left. You're flying more or less right over the shore, just on the water side. So that pilot's basically just seeing land, and that side is actually brighter than the right side because DCA, compared to the rest of like Crystal City in that area, is pretty dark.
Yeah.
And so, you might think like, oh, well, there's airplanes and there's all this other stuff going on. Yeah, but you're in a major metropolitan area. DCA is actually the darkest kind of area right there. That airplane that they end up hitting, or instead of however you want to look at it, they end up colliding with, you've got the one that's landing runway 1 that's right down the river that they're expecting to pass out their right door. And if they just stay on the river, it's going to be a non-factor, and they are going to pass behind it. Keeping in mind, they don't know there's traffic landing 3-3 because that got cut off.
Yeah.
Keep in mind, they've probably never actually seen somebody land 3-3. Meanwhile, the airplane that the CRJ is slowly moving out their left window down closer to the lights.
Is there like a pillar, like an A pillar or something in the way here too?
It's possible. Yeah, and it's possible. I know that's going to be something that the NTSB looks at. There's a pillar there. There's really probably there's kind of 2. There's one for the door, and then there's one in kind of more or less the middle. So there's 3 panels just in the middle. One smaller one, and then a bigger one left, a bigger one right, and then you've got the doors on each side. So it'd really be kind of the panel in between the door and the cockpit window. that's the only one that would maybe come into play. But even if it didn't, as they get closer to the ground,
Yeah.
and they're gonna be at some point right at kind of the because it's also not just like look at the horizon. There's
Right.
like 15-story buildings there.
Right. Right. Right.
You've
Right.
got the casino that's over there.
Mhm.
You've got the Ferris wheel, which is on a pier that's right there, and you're lower than all that stuff.
Oh,
You're at
wow.
200 feet. All of that stuff is above you.
Yeah.
So it's not just like look at the horizon. It's actually buildings that are actually above the horizon as well. Um, so it would have been right at or maybe just barely above the horizon with a landing light that's kind of going away from you. So maybe not as bright as it normally would be. They're in an area that you're not expecting, might be behind, parts of the aircraft. You're looking through a 40-degree field of view. Like all of this just would make it really hard to pick up at that point, especially if you're convinced that it's this other aircraft that's doing what you normally see them do.
What's the crew chief doing? Is he on NVGs? Is he looking out for traffic? Like, is he
Yes.
following along? Like, does he know he should be looking for an RJ? Like, what's his role in all this?
So number one, I think it being an RJ is irrelevant because all they are is bright lights at this point.
Right. I mean, an aircraft.
So
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but an aircraft, yeah. Yes, the crew chief would, and this is an experienced crew chief.
Mhm.
He was briefly in the same company as me. I, kind of met him, but then he went to another company. I retired shortly thereafter. I knew him by reputation though, and he has an awesome reputation.
Yeah.
Um, and so yeah, again, in terms of qualifications, he's my peer in terms of being able to instruct crew chiefs. Um, awesome reputation. I knew guys from my company when he went to the other company that would still be like, "Oh, I'll just call Ryan, he'll know."
Mm.
So if any crew chief kind of could have gotten it right, it would have been him.
It looked like from the data that the Blackhawk just no idea. They made no reaction. I mean,
Yeah,
based on the control inputs, right? I mean, is that didn't look like because they said it's like just a little bit of that just looks like they're flying straight level to
that's
me.
yeah. From when I looked at that, I'm like, that's pretty normal bank. And actually, if you look at some, I've seen some of the breadcrumbs drop from I don't know if it's from the Mozi or what it's from, but it looks to me like they slowed back from 100. Talk more about the altitude. It looked to me like they slowed back from 100 knots indicated to 80. I could see a couple different scenarios here where either you're like, hey man, they just asked us again something, that the part that where it says pass behind is cut off.
Hair on the
They
back
keyed
of
the
your
mic.
neck. Yep. Start standing
Yeah,
up.
they keyed the mic and they stepped on that. I've done that a million times. I'm sure you have too, where you
Hmm.
like your finger is slower than your brain. You're like, oh crap. But
Yeah.
I'll say back what I think they need me to say back. If it's important, they'll tell me, right? And so he just said traffic in sight, request visual separation again, which I think is pretty reasonable to do in that scenario, um, because you're still thinking like it's that airplane. I'm still going to maintain visual separation.
Hmm.
Um, and because you didn't hear pass behind or any other information, like there's nothing to draw your attention over there.
Circling or anything. There's no
No, nothing like
runway
that. But I
33.
think but I could see a scenario where you're like, that's weird because I've never one time been asked there twice to verify that I have the aircraft in sight. So I could see where you're like, kind of amongst yourselves, crew coordination wise, where you're like, hey, let's slow back to 80 knots here. Like, I feel like maybe our situational awareness is not what it's supposed to be, or let's like give ourselves some extra time here. Let's just
Hmm.
slow back a little bit. I could see where you kind of have that conversation and you do it intentionally
Hmm.
among both pilots, and both pilots know what's going on. The the other scenario I could see is where um, just one pilot, the person on the flight controls, does it intentionally, which is probably Becca Lobach. Um, hey, he's talking, he's doing other stuff. As a matter of, I just think it's the right thing to do right now. She's a pilot in command. Hey, let me just slow back a little bit. Seems reasonable,
Hmm.
but I don't have time
Hmm.
to articulate it. Or again, big muscles beat little muscles. Hey, something's not right here. I don't know exactly what's going on. Something, and just you start slowing back a little bit and you pull back on the cyclic just a little bit. So if you do that and you slow back 20 knots and you pull aft cyclic in a Blackhawk, you are going to climb
Yeah.
unless you are super on top of your collective. So again, in this scenario, they don't have anything helping them out. There's no autopilot to keep them on their altitude. And so now it's on the pilot who's in this situation where it's like, oh, this is kind of weird. I'm trying to look at the traffic. There's other stuff going on. They're down and
Hmm.
potentially down or right at the lights anyway. So there's really nothing to see. Maybe you're looking over there. Maybe you're still looking at these guys. And you just kind of slow back for whatever reason to 80 knots. But if you're not on top of your collective and get it down right away,
Yeah.
100-foot climb would be really easy. So that's why I've been saying, like, I think it's somewhere between possible and likely that they did climb 100 feet or so.
Yeah.
Um, And that wouldn't be, if I saw somebody do that, I wouldn't beat them up too bad for it.
Yeah.
Because it's just so easy to do, especially given the scenario. Where it's like, well, that was within reason. That was the right thing to do. So I don't want to beat you too bad up, because I think slowing back would be the right thing to do.
Yeah.
If you feel like your situational awareness is kind of eroded. So I wouldn't want to beat you up too bad for climbing 100 knots because you were trying to do the right thing to regain your situational awareness with the, I'm not saying we wouldn't debrief it.
Yeah.
But it's definitely not a place where you're going to be like, oh, my aircraft, and take the flight controls and do
Right.
anything like that. Because and chances are it would only be for a few seconds. Like like I said, I've been off on altitude there before. Hey man, what altitude are we supposed to be at? 200 feet. Okay, let's come on down, because it can happen really fast.
Yeah,
And because of the way that they were supposed to be at the top altitude, there's nowhere for you to go. 200 plus 0, right?
Right.
But you've built no margin. But you built no margin because of the procedures, because the book says what the book says.
What do you think the fix is? Is there a fix? I mean, initially in the couple days after, they shut down all the helicopter routes, which I don't know how you operate. I mean, what do we do? Where do we go from here?
So I mean, I think the fix is, number one, and you pointed out, like, they just keep adding more traffic into DCA.
Yeah.
Right. So we can say like helicopter traffic, but the helicopter traffic predates DCA existing.
Right.
I don't know when the helo route started, but in terms of how much traffic is there now, like, those helicopter routes have been there for decades. So this is a situation where the airport came and grew after the helicopter routes. But it is what it is now. So I think the main thing is keep helicopters off Route 4 when they're landing 3-3, because it's just too much.
Yeah. Make them hold.
Yeah. So it becomes kind of like, kind of a ridiculous proposition if you go too far, where it's like, ultimately you can go like, well, let's keep them east of that. Okay, well, where do you want to go? So then you got Anacostia Bowling right there. Well, that won't really work. Let's go east of that. Well, then you got Andrews. Well, that's not really going to work. Let's go east of that. And it's like, okay, well, let's just have them fly over the Atlantic.
Yeah.
It becomes at some point a little,
Mm-hmm.
just not within reason, so that they can still do the stuff that they have to do.
Yeah.
Because of their mission set. The easiest thing to me is just they shouldn't be in the same spot. They would usually hold us at Haynes Point, which is just in the north, about a mile or maybe a little bit less north. If they're landing 3-3, or there's a place called Golf Balls. So it's just radar towers that are right there on the east side of the water. It's not depicted. It's not on the chart. So Haynes Point is, Golf Balls isn't, but they're about the same distance away.
Yeah.
And so if they were landing 3-3 and we were going north, they would hold us at Golf Balls.
Oh, okay.
So procedurally, I'm not willing to say that like procedure is broken in this case, because I don't know that is the like prescribed,
Right.
legal procedure. I really hope it wasn't. I hope that this can all be chalked up to, hey, it was a bad procedure, and that the controller was operating within allowable procedure, and was saying, he was giving the minimum amount of information. Could they give more? Yeah, they could always give more. Right. But he's pretty busy too. And he was put in a bad situation by being a single controller. So I hope that this is going to be, hey, that was probably a better procedure to hold them, but it wasn't prescriptive. They didn't have to do it. And with the visual separation, the other stuff, within reason, he could have thought that they would be good. That would be an easy fix. I think they're probably going to go more than that at this point. So it's going to be like, whatever makes everybody feel good plus 3.
Yeah. So the Blackhawk crew, you knew or knew of all of them. I mean, all strong swimmers, good pilots, good crew chief. Like, there's nothing.
Yeah,
you're
never going to get a 100%. I shouldn't say you're never going to get 100%. It's rare that you get 100% of people that are like awesome.
Yeah.
And this crew in total is about as close as I've ever seen. I've been not on the X investigation, but I've done some reconstruction stuff for flight school. I've known a few guys that have been in crashes. So anybody that wants to say like, oh, is this guy trying to protect his friends? Not the case. If I know people that I would look at that I would consider friends, and I would say, yeah, and they were incompetent in that moment.
Yeah.
This is not one of those cases. This is one of those cases where everybody at the unit, and myself included, who has more hours than both the pilots combined in that Blackhawk, I would look at it and go, 100% could have been me. Like, I don't think putting me in that seat does anything in this situation necessarily. But then talking about kind of their reputations, especially Andrew, man, he was solid. You know, there's a lot of crashes where I'm sure you've heard this one or maybe even been a part of saying this before. We're like, it was only a matter of time. Like we all kind of knew.
Yeah.
And as soon as this one happened, I said this on like Fox News. I said, this is not going to be a scenario where anybody says that. This guy was not a risk taker. He was super competent. He was the guy when he was a new co-pilot. It's funny. So as a stands guy, but especially, you know, instructor pilots and stands pilots, when you walk out in the kind of common areas that the pilots hang out in the briefing rooms or whatever, and they're all hanging out there in planning rooms, you tend to have like a cockroach and light effect on people. I'm not sure if that happens in the Air Force or the Navy,
military.
but yeah. You walk in, if you're the guy that is responsible for giving evals and you're responsible for making sure everybody's trained up, nobody really wants to be made to look stupid. And if you hear them talking enough, you're going to go, hold on, what did you just say? So that's just kind of a natural thing that happens everywhere. Now, I tried to not be that person, but you know, some people were intimidated for whatever reason, and they just don't want to be there. They want to be asked questions. Andrew was the guy that was in stands all the time. You know, hey Austin, he's a big dude from Mississippi. Hey Austin, you know, I think about whatever. Can you know, I've just been thinking about this, or I looked at this and I read this up. Is that right? Is this the right way to think about this? Can you show me how to do whatever? He was the opposite of that. There was 2 or 3 pilots in that unit that were kind of like that, and they were all really close. And he was one of those, or maybe even the leader of the pack when it came to that.
Yeah.
He was absolutely awesome. Becca Lobach, great reputation. I didn't know her. She was there at the same time as me, asking people. Yeah, great reputation. You know, the DEI question has been brought up. She's top 20% of her class. That's about where you still got to pass the flight physical. That lops a bunch of people off, even people that are otherwise qualified. You still got to pass the flight aptitude battery. That's going to lop a bunch of people off. So you're going to lose a bunch of people just from that. And then you're down to the top 10 or 5% of people. And then not everybody wants to be an aviation officer in the Army.
Yeah.
And so she was exactly where I would expect, having been on the flight line, looking at kind of her credentials for somebody to be selected for flight school, become a PIC about when you would expect. Everybody really thought the world of her as a pilot, as a person, even more so. I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about somebody that I don't know with kind of as like glowing endorsement. Just really thought the world of her. One person anecdotally told me, another stands guy, every time he would start talking, she'd be like, hold on a second. And she would run and get a notepad and come back and start writing down. And me as an instructor and as SP, I'm like, dang, man, I don't know if anybody's ever done that. He was like, every time he started talking, she'd be like, hold on a second, and write it down. Yeah, so she was famous for having this really big notepad just with all the stuff that she wrote down.
That's awesome.
That's why she was put in the position that she was in, because she was really well thought of as an officer outside of the cockpit. And then Ryan O'Hara, really, really excellent reputation. So it's a good crew. No matter what people think in terms of the hours or whatever, like that is a crew that on paper nobody would bat an eye at. That is a low risk crew.
Well, Austin, appreciate you coming on the channel and explaining all this stuff to us. I had no idea on a lot of it, so I've learned today, and I hope everybody else will learn. And I know it's polarizing. Everybody wants to be angry, but I think the facts need to come out more than feelings, and that's what it's going to come down to.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being on the show. We'll see you around. Do they have a website they can find you? Is it Break Turn?
Yeah, breakturn.com. If you need to do a skill bridge, if you're in the military still, breakturn.com, and then app.breakturn.com if you just want to do some. This is not just for veterans, but if you are interested in learning how to be a pilot, a maintainer, eventually dispatcher, helicopter pilot, it'll build like an online course for you, and that's all free.
Awesome, thank you. All right, thanks for being on the channel.
Thanks, Mover.